Hi everyone, in this video we are going to discuss sugars, so the yummy, delicious, sweet part of the carbohydrate family. So what I want to do really quickly before we dive any deeper into the sugar component is create a quick flow chart to help organize all this information. So let's start off with carbohydrates at the top, which we know are molecules that are comprised of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and our hydrogen and oxygen are always in a 2-to-1 ratio. And we know that we can break our carbohydrates into sugars or into starches. And so for our sugars, usually we say these are comprised of two different sections. You either have your monosaccharides or you have your disaccharides. Whereas our starches are primarily your polysaccharides. So because this video is about sugars, I'm going to primarily ignore the starches for the rest of this time, and we're just going to focus on the sugar section from here on out. So our disaccharides has one common example that we always talk about, and that is sucrose. Okay, so we have sucrose, which is our example for our disaccharide, where our monosaccharide, we usually break that into two different sections. We either have glucose or fructose. But the thing is, whether or not something is a monosaccharide or a disaccharide does not tell us any information about how sweet that is when we ingest it into our human body. What does it taste like to us? So glucose, fructose, and sucrose all have very different sweetness levels. And so what we have is created something that's really neat. And so we have a sugar section and a relative sweetness. And so basically what's happened is a bunch of scientists were able to come together and create a relative sweetness scale so that we can essentially rank our different sugars in terms of what they taste like or how our body responds to ingesting that sugar or that type of carbohydrate. So the first thing I want to do is just list out a couple sugars here. The first one is going to be lactose. And so that has a relative sweetness of about 16. And so lactose is something that is commonly found in breast milk. Okay. Then we also have glucose. Glucose is about 74.3. Then we have honey. Most of us have probably tried honey before. Honey is relatively sweet. It has a sweetness level of about 97. We also have sucrose. So our disaccharide, sucrose has a sweetness level of about 100. So it's about 25 more, whatever our unit is. This is a relative scale. So it's about 25% greater than our glucose is. Now after sucrose, we're going to talk about fructose. So another monosaccharide. Fructose is actually significantly sweeter than both glucose or sucrose, and that has a sweetness level of 173. So now what I'm going to do is create this little line here, because I want to separate two sections. These first 5 that I've listed out are all natural sweeteners. All of them are natural. But now I want to list out 3 different synthetic ones. So the first one I'm going to list is aspartame, and that has a sweetness level of about 200. The next one is called saccharin, and that one's about 300. And this last one is something I just think is so interesting. We've actually been able to create, because all these are synthetics, so think man-made, so we've actually been able to create 3 different levels. This one, the neotame, is a sweetness level of 7,000 to 13,000. It just kind of depends on how much you have of it, which is insane. That is so, so sweet. We've all ingested honey. Honey is 97, so this is something that is way sweeter than honey. So I just can't even imagine that. I've never had it personally. So the thing I want to point out about the synthetic components is that they are so sweet compared to glucose that we only use a tiny amount. So we use a small amount relative to all of our other natural sugars. Okay, we use just a tiny hint of this. So now what I want to do is give you 2 more pieces, all right? There are 2 more synthetic sweeteners. One of them is this one. It's acesulfame potassium. Okay, that's your first one. And then the second one I want to give you is called sucralose. Okay, and now both of these are also synthetic sweeteners. So I want you to guess what their relative sweetness levels are. And the only information you have is this chart we've comprised. And the thing I'm going to ask you is, are their sweetness values greater than 200 or less than 200? Okay, which one is it? For both of them. Go. All right, did you get an answer? Hopefully you did, but if you didn't, that's okay. Basically, what I wanted you to be able to see from our chart here is that if we ever have a synthetic sugar. So if a scientist is in a lab and they're trying to actually craft a sugar and create a sugar for humans to ingest, there is no point to making a sugar that is not as sweet as things that come naturally, specifically sucrose and fructose. So the only reason we're going to have a synthetic sugar that is out in the US for anybody here to use, it is definitely going to have a sweetness level that is greater than 200. Okay, so just keep that in mind, and that might also help you kind of rank these different sweeteners and sugars in your own brain, okay, for your own life. Now, just to give you relative values, this one is actually 200, and then our sucralose is actually of a value of about 600. So the last thing I want to do before I move on is I just want to point out a couple things here. So right now, what we know is that our fructose is our fruit sugar. Okay, so whenever you're thinking of fructose, I want you to be thinking of your fruit sugars, okay? Your sucrose, that's going to be your table sugar. So anytime you're sitting outside, or you're outside, I guess, or you're at your table and you're eating Cheerios, you add sugar, you're actually adding sucrose to your system, and then you're actually ingesting that into your body. Whereas glucose is going to be two different types of sugar. A lot of times we call them your blood sugars, and then we also know that this is also your corn sugar. And I'm pointing this out because I want to take a little tangent and talk about high fructose corn syrup. So let me give you a whole different category here. So high fructose corn syrup. So there's a couple things I want to point out about this because a lot of times it's in the news and we hear about it. The first thing is high fructose corn syrup is a glucose fructose mixture. Okay, so it's not just fructose. That's a common misconception, but that's just not the case. How they make it is they take glucose from corn. Okay, so they grow tons and tons of corn. They take the sugars that naturally exist in corn, which is glucose, and they use enzymes to flip one of the carbon atoms. They flip it, basically, so your enzyme is a catalyst, and what that does is it converts the glucose to your fructose. And so in the end, you end up with a glucose-fructose mixture. They can't convert all of the glucose, but they convert enough of it that you end up with a high fructose syrup. And your corn syrup is supposed to be glucose. So hopefully that makes a little bit more sense of where that name comes from. Now, that's how they make it. Why do we care about it? First things first is it's really bad for the environment. Really, really bad for the environment. And there's three main things why. The first one is that you have to burn fossil fuels. In order to do any of this, you have to burn fossil fuels. And that's because they have pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizer that's all requiring a fossil fuel production in order to even get there and actually create the corn and create the glucose and fructose in order to create the syrup, okay? So you have to burn fossil fuels. That's step one. The second thing that's really bad for the environment is there's a lot of runoff from these cornfields into streams and rivers. And it's so bad that there's actually a huge dead zone at the mouth of the Mississippi River, that it's just dead because all of these chemicals, these herbicides, pesticides, fertilizer, have all run off the cornfields into the water and just killed everything there. And the last thing, which is actually kind of weird, is that this runoff often contains nitrogen and phosphorus. And so what happens is when this goes into the water, what happens is you have huge algae blooms. And what happens is this algae then comes in, it depletes the oxygen, and then that is what kills a bunch of the aquatic life. So these two things, B and C, usually run hand in hand. All right, so you have the runoff into the stream, which is just bad. It pollutes the stream. And then on top of that, all that nitrogen that's really rich in the fertilizer, which we'll talk about the nitrogen cycle in the future, but all that nitrogen there is rich. It creates these algae blooms, and you have all this algae. It depletes the oxygen from within the water, and then the fish literally just suffocate. They die. It's really, really sad. So that's what high fructose corn syrup is. And before I move on to the last really preachy, motherly thing that I want to tell you is I want to ask you for your own diet, please be a little bit self-respective here. And I want you to look inside and kind of think, do you eat the appropriate amount of sugar just based on everything I told you here? What do you think? Do you eat too much sugar or an appropriate amount of sugar? Go. All right, did you get an answer? Hopefully you did. And if I had to guess, knowing nothing about you, my answer, I would think that you would say would be no, but probably the true answer is yes. Most adults eat way too much sugar. They have way too much sugar in their body or in their diet. And the reason that's such an issue is that if you ingest more than your body can actually handle, it ends up causing either obesity or diabetes, among other things. Obesity, we all know if you get really big, it's just not good on your body. It's not good on your organs. It's really difficult for your heart to constantly pump and get the blood and the oxygen to where it needs to go. Same thing with diabetes. If you have diabetes, you can lose limbs like your feet, and you could also, just like with obesity, you could also die. So you need to be really, really mindful of this. And so just so you have a frame of reference, on average, this is not true for everybody, the average, in fact, I want to put this here, the average woman and the average man can consume, so for a woman, it's 100 calories, capital C, so we're talking nutritional calories, of sugar per day. So to give you a little frame of reference, because 100 calories is kind of hard to measure, this is about 6 teaspoons of sugar, teaspoons, not tablespoons, teaspoons, or about 25 grams. Okay, 25 grams of sugar. Whereas the average man, you lucky men, you can have a little bit more. You're allowed to have about 150 calories of sugar per day. And so now just to give you a frame of reference as well, this is equivalent to about 9 teaspoons, again teaspoons, not tablespoons, the smaller ones, 9 teaspoons, and it's about 37.5 grams of sugar per day. It is not a lot. So I would go back personally, if I were you, I'd recommend go back through, check the nutritional labels, just figure out how much is there. Is there a lot? Is there a little? I don't know. Take care of yourself, drink water, and eat well.